You're not on the founding board anymore, Margaret. It's time you stepped aside, Emily said, sliding the revised company program across the polished oak conference table as if she were passing the salt at Sunday dinner. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant rhythm of traffic outside the downtown Chicago office building where Whitmore Logistics had operated for nearly 4 decades. Margaret Whitmore, 67 years old, co-founder of the company, widow of the man whose name was etched in brushed steel in the lobby downstairs, looked down at the printed agenda without immediately touching it. Her name, once listed in bold under founding partners, now appeared near the bottom under advisory, retired. She did not react. She did not clear her throat. She did not defend herself. She simply folded her hands neatly on the table, the same hands that had once sorted invoices at a card table in a 400-square-foot garage when this family project had consisted of one delivery truck and a borrowed phone line. Around her sat 12 department heads, most of whom she had personally hired, trained, and, in some cases, comforted through divorces, illnesses, and layoffs during the lean years. No one met her eyes. Daniel Whitmore, her only son and the company's current CEO, adjusted his cufflinks and stared at the screen at the front of the room, where a sleek new presentation displayed the words modern leadership transition. He did not object. He did not look surprised. He looked practiced. Margaret noticed that detail more than anything else. Emily, 38, polished and precise in a navy sheath dress, continued speaking in a tone so reasonable it almost sounded generous. She talked about growth projections, digital restructuring, market relevance. She used phrases like long-term sustainability and generational evolution. She did not once say the word replace. Margaret listened carefully, not to the presentation, but to the silences between sentences. She noticed how easily her past contributions had been condensed into a single slide titled Legacy Phase. She noticed that the new voting structure removed her veto power on structural changes. She noticed that the legal counsel seated at the end of the table avoided flipping past page 6. The conference room windows reflected the skyline back at her, and for a moment she saw not the gray in her hair, but the woman who had once driven a delivery van through Midwest snowstorms because an order had to arrive by 8 a.m. sharp. She remembered balancing payroll against mortgage payments, remembered skipping vacations so the company could purchase its second warehouse. Emily finished speaking and smiled, a small, satisfied smile that never reached her eyes. "We thought this would ease your workload," she added gently. The implication hovered in the air. Margaret picked up the packet at last. The paper felt smooth and expensive, far removed from the carbon copy forms she used to staple by hand. She turned one page, then another. Her expression did not change. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have seen the smallest shift in her posture, a subtle straightening of her spine, as though something inside her had aligned. "Is there any discussion?" Daniel asked, his voice carefully neutral. There was none. Heads nodded. Pens tapped lightly against leather notebooks. Margaret closed the folder and placed it precisely in front of her. She looked first at her son, then at her daughter-in-law, and offered a small, polite smile. It was the same smile she had worn at client dinners, at bank meetings, at community fundraisers when the company's future had depended on steady nerves. She said nothing. She did not argue about history. She did not list sacrifices. She did not remind them whose signature secured the original loan. Instead, she reached into her handbag and retrieved her reading glasses, sliding them back into their case, as if the meeting were simply another item on her calendar. The board moved on to quarterly earnings. Outside, a siren wailed faintly and faded. Inside, a transition had just been announced. But what no one in that room understood, not even Daniel, was that Margaret Whitmore had never built a business without reading every line of the fine print first, and she had no intention of starting now. The meeting adjourned at 11:30 in the morning, and the executives filtered out of the conference room with the careful politeness people use when they suspect a shift in power but do not yet understand its direction. Margaret remained seated for a moment after the chairs scraped back and the projector screen dimmed. She gathered her folder, aligned its edges against the table, and stood without asking for assistance. Daniel was already speaking quietly with Emily near the doorway. Emily nodded once, satisfied. Her tablet tucked neatly under her arm. Margaret noticed how naturally her daughter-in-law now occupied the center of the space, greeting managers by first name, issuing small instructions about follow-up emails and revised reporting structures. It was efficient. It was rehearsed. It was deliberate. Margaret walked past them with the same composed expression she had worn for decades in negotiations. Daniel offered a quick, restrained smile. "We will talk later, Mom," he said, as though postponing a minor scheduling matter. She inclined her head in acknowledgement and continued down the hallway toward her corner office. The brass nameplate on the frosted glass still read Margaret Whitmore, founder. She paused there for a fraction of a second before opening the door. Inside, nothing had changed. The framed photograph of the first delivery truck sat on the bookshelf. The original business license, dated 1987, hung slightly crooked as it always had. The office smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. Yet something in the air felt thinner, as if oxygen had been quietly reduced. She placed her folder on the desk and turned on her desktop computer, the machine taking its time to hum to life. An email notification appeared almost immediately. Updated access permissions. She opened it calmly. Effective immediately, her administrative clearance for operational banking and vendor contract approvals had been modified to advisory level. No explanation. No apology. Just a system-generated notice. She read the message twice, not because she did not understand it, but because she wanted to measure its tone. Down the hall, she could hear Emily's voice drifting from the executive suite, confident and measured. Margaret rose and walked to the window. 12 stories below, trucks bearing the company logo rolled out of the loading dock, each one a reminder of years measured not in profits, but in persistence. She remembered winters when revenue barely covered fuel costs, remembered sitting at this same desk calculating payroll to the nearest dollar so that no employee missed a mortgage payment. She had never drawn attention to those calculations. She had simply done them. Her phone rang. It was Thomas Reed, the company's chief financial officer for nearly 3 decades before stepping into a semi-retired consulting role. "I saw the revised agenda," he said evenly. "Yes," Margaret replied. "So did I." There was a pause on the line, long enough to hold unspoken concern. "They moved quickly," he added. Margaret allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Quick decisions are not always thorough decisions," she said. She did not sound wounded. She sounded observant. After the call ended, she opened the leather-bound binder she kept in the bottom drawer of her desk. Inside were copies of the original partnership agreement, amendments written in her late husband's careful handwriting, and clauses drafted long before digital templates simplified language into bullet points. She turned the pages slowly, her eyes scanning the dense paragraphs. Outside her office, footsteps passed by without stopping. No one knocked. No one asked for her signature. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a new organizational chart had been circulated company-wide. Her title read Founder Emeritus. Advisory. Ceremonial. Margaret closed the binder and placed it gently on her desk. She did not call a meeting. She did not request clarification. Instead, she reached for her legal pad and began making a list in neat, deliberate script. Dates, signatures, voting thresholds, procedural requirements. Each line was written without haste. In the executive suite, Emily laughed softly at something Daniel said. In her office, Margaret Whitmore sharpened her pencil and continued writing. On Monday morning at 9 o'clock sharp, Margaret Whitmore stepped into the office of Jonathan Keller, the attorney who had drafted the original incorporation documents nearly 4 decades earlier and who still practiced in a modest brick building 10 blocks from the company headquarters. The reception area smelled faintly of paper and polished wood, unchanged by trends or renovation. Jonathan, now 74, rose from behind his desk when she entered his office. He did not offer sympathy. He offered a chair. Margaret placed her leather binder on the desk between them and opened it to Section 9 without preamble. Jonathan adjusted his reading glasses and scanned the page slowly, his finger tracing the margin where 2 signatures rested side by side, Margaret's and her late husband's, dated July 1987. "This clause has never been amended," he said after a moment. Margaret shook her head. "Not to my knowledge." Jonathan leaned back in his chair. "Then any structural reclassification of your role without your explicit written consent is procedurally incomplete." He did not raise his voice. He did not dramatize the conclusion. He simply stated it. Margaret listened with the same composure she had maintained. In the boardroom, "They have already circulated the new organizational chart," she said. Jonathan nodded once. "Circulation is not ratification." He turned to his computer and pulled up the current corporate filings. Within minutes, he identified the preliminary restructuring documents Thomas had mentioned. Draft status. Pending signatures. Margaret folded her hands on her lap. "If I remain silent, what happens?" she asked. Jonathan considered the question carefully. "If you do nothing, the perception of your retirement will solidify. Over time, silence may be interpreted as consent. However, legally speaking, without your signature, the transition cannot be finalized." Margaret absorbed that information without visible reaction. Outside the office window, late summer sunlight filtered through the trees lining the street. Traffic moved steadily. "What would you recommend?" she asked. Jonathan closed the file on his screen and met her gaze directly. "Formally request a review of the restructuring under the original charter provisions. Call for a founder vote. Require compliance with unanimous consent as stated." "That is not confrontation. That is procedure." Margaret nodded slowly. Procedure. She had built her life around that word. After the meeting concluded, she walked back toward the parking garage, her steps measured and unhurried. She did not feel triumphant. She felt prepared. By 11:30, she was back in her office overlooking the loading dock. An email from Emily awaited her in her inbox, cheerful in tone, outlining next steps for leadership transition and inviting her to a ceremonial luncheon recognizing her legacy contributions. Margaret read the message once. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she drafted a formal memorandum addressed to the board of directors, citing specific sections of the 1987 charter and requesting a special session to review proposed amendments under founder consent requirements. The language was precise, neutral, undeniable. She attached a scanned copy of the relevant clause with both original signatures clearly visible. Before pressing send, she reviewed every sentence for tone. There was no accusation, no emotional appeal, only reference to policy. At 12:15 in the afternoon, she clicked send. Within seconds, confirmation receipts began appearing in her inbox as board members opened the document. Down the hall, a door closed more firmly than usual. Margaret remained seated, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady. She reached for her planner and circled Friday at 10 o'clock in the morning, the time she had proposed for the special session. Outside her office, the rhythm of the company continued uninterrupted. Trucks departed. Phones rang. Emails traveled across servers. Yet beneath that ordinary movement, a different process had begun. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was procedural. And in a company built on contracts, procedures were stronger than impressions. By 2 o'clock that afternoon the response arrived, not as a reply to her memorandum, but as a calendar invitation marked urgent executive discussion. The meeting was scheduled for Friday at 10 o'clock, precisely the time Margaret had proposed, but the subject line read clarification of founder status. She noticed the wording immediately. Clarification suggested misunderstanding. It did not acknowledge authority. She accepted the invitation without comment. Over the next 2 days, the atmosphere inside the building shifted in subtle but measurable ways. Conversations lowered when she entered shared spaces. Department heads who had once sought her guidance now seemed careful not to appear aligned. It was not hostility. It was uncertainty. Margaret did not attempt to correct it. Instead, she continued arriving at 8:30 each morning, reviewing reports, signing the documents still within her advisory scope, and greeting employees by name in the hallway. On Thursday evening, Daniel appeared at her office door after most of the staff had left. He knocked once before stepping inside. "I saw your memo," he said, remaining standing. Margaret looked up from the ledger she had been reviewing and removed her reading glasses slowly. "I assumed you would," she replied. Daniel exhaled, choosing his words with care. "This was supposed to be a respectful transition. Emily thought you would appreciate less pressure." Margaret folded her glasses and placed them neatly on the desk. "Pressure built this company," she said evenly. "Removing me from procedure without discussion is not respect. It is revision." Daniel shifted his weight, glancing briefly toward the window. "We are trying to modernize," he insisted. Margaret nodded once. "Modernization does not eliminate contracts," she answered. There was no sharpness in her tone, only clarity. Daniel hesitated, then added, "You could have spoken to me first." Margaret held his gaze. "You could have as well." The silence that followed was not loud, but it was definitive. After a moment, Daniel straightened his jacket. "Friday will settle it," he said quietly. Margaret inclined her head. "Yes," she replied. When he left, she remained seated, her posture unchanged. She did not replay the conversation in frustration. She reviewed it as she would any negotiation, noting the emphasis on perception, the reliance on speed, the assumption of compliance. On Friday morning, the board assembled in the same conference room where the transition had first been presented. The polished oak table reflected the overhead lights. Copies of the 1987 charter rested in front of each member, placed there by Margaret before the meeting began. Emily entered last, composed and poised, carrying a tablet and a thin folder. Daniel called the session to order. Margaret waited until procedural formalities concluded before speaking. She did not raise her voice. She did not reference emotion. She referred only to Section 9, Founder Protections, and the requirement of unanimous written consent for structural amendment affecting founder status. She requested confirmation from legal counsel that no such consent had been provided. Counsel adjusted his tie and confirmed that no signed amendment from Margaret Whitmore existed in the records. The room remained still. Emily began outlining projected growth metrics, emphasizing efficiency and generational leadership alignment, but Margaret did not interrupt. When Emily finished, Margaret addressed the board again. "I am not opposing growth," she said calmly. "I am opposing procedural omission." The distinction settled heavily across the table. Thomas Reed, seated midway down, cleared his throat and affirmed that compliance with the original charter was mandatory until formally amended by all required parties. Margaret concluded with a single sentence. "If modernization is necessary, let us do it correctly." She then folded her hands and waited. The discussion that followed was measured, no longer confident, and noticeably more cautious than before. Outside the window, delivery trucks continued to depart on schedule, unaware that inside the building the balance of authority had begun to shift, not through confrontation, but through documentation. The board did not vote that morning. Instead, they recessed with an agreement to reconvene after a formal legal review of the charter provisions. It was not the decisive victory Emily had anticipated, nor was it a public reversal. It was something quieter and far more significant. It was delay. And delay, Margaret understood, allowed clarity to return. By early afternoon, a company-wide email announced that the proposed restructuring would be placed under procedural evaluation to ensure full compliance with founding documents. The language was neutral. It did not assign fault. It did not mention her memorandum. Yet everyone in the building understood that something had interrupted the narrative of smooth transition. Margaret returned to her office without acknowledging the subtle shift in hallway glances. She closed her door, not to isolate herself, but to concentrate. On her desk lay two folders. One contained the original 1987 charter. The other contained recent financial performance summaries Emily had circulated to justify modernization. Margaret reviewed both side by side. Revenue had increased steadily over the past 5 years, but so had executive compensation and discretionary spending on branding initiatives. The company was stable, but it was no longer cautious. She made notes in her precise handwriting, not criticisms, simply observations. At 3 o'clock, Thomas Reed stepped in again, closing the door gently behind him. "The board is uneasy," he said. "Not about you. About exposure." Margaret looked up. "Exposure to what?" Thomas adjusted his glasses. "If founder consent was bypassed once, it raises questions about other procedural shortcuts." Margaret absorbed that quietly. Reputation had always been the company's strongest asset. Not innovation, not expansion, trust. "Then the review must be thorough," she replied. Thomas nodded. "Emily is pushing for an expedited amendment. She wants you to sign a revised founder agreement that converts your shares into ceremonial equity." Margaret allowed a faint smile. "Ceremonial equity generates ceremonial influence," she said. Thomas returned the smile, brief but understanding. After he left, Margaret drafted another document. This one was not a challenge. It was a proposal. She outlined a structured succession framework that preserved founder voting rights, while gradually delegating operational authority under defined benchmarks. Performance metrics, risk thresholds, compliance audits. It was not emotional. It was strategic. She attached projected timelines measured in quarters, not weeks. By 5:30 in the evening, she emailed the document to the board and to Daniel directly. The subject line read Structured Transition Proposal. She did not send it to Emily separately. If Emily wished to review it, she would receive it as part of the executive distribution list, just as Margaret now received internal updates. An hour later, Daniel appeared again at her doorway, this time without knocking. He held a printed copy of her proposal. "You have been working on this for a while," he said quietly. Margaret did not deny it. "I began drafting succession plans the year you became vice president," she answered. Daniel looked down at the pages, scanning the detailed benchmarks. "This keeps you on the board indefinitely," he observed. Margaret shook her head. "It keeps the company stable during transition. There is a difference." The office lights reflected in the window behind him as dusk settled over the city. Daniel's expression shifted from defensiveness to contemplation. "Emily thinks you do not trust her," he said. Margaret met his eyes evenly. "Trust is not removed by oversight," she replied. "It is strengthened by it." Daniel stood there a moment longer, then nodded once and left without further argument. Margaret turned back to her desk and powered down her computer. She gathered her binder and placed it carefully into her bag. As she walked through the lobby toward the elevator, she noticed that her husband's name beneath the company logo seemed steadier than it had the week before. Nothing about the steel letters had changed. Only the way they were being interpreted had. The elevator doors closed, and in the quiet descent to the parking garage, Margaret felt no surge of triumph. She felt alignment. The company had been built on structure. It would remain protected by it. And for the first time since the transition had been announced, uncertainty no longer belonged to her. The legal review concluded the following Wednesday at 9:45 in the morning, and the findings were circulated to the board before most employees had finished their first cup of coffee. The conclusion was precise and without embellishment. The proposed restructuring, as drafted, did not satisfy the unanimous founder consent requirement outlined in the 1987 charter. No accusation. No reprimand. Just fact. By 10:30, the board reconvened in the same conference room, the atmosphere notably different from the earlier presentation of transition plans. This time, copies of Margaret's structured succession proposal were placed beside each member's agenda. Daniel opened the session with a measured tone, acknowledging the legal clarification and inviting discussion on compliant paths forward. Emily sat upright, her tablet resting flat on the table, her expression composed but tighter than before. Margaret did not speak immediately. She allowed the room to absorb the legal language. One board member, a logistics director who had joined the company 15 years earlier, asked for clarification on the founder voting threshold. Legal counsel confirmed again that any change affecting founder classification required Margaret's written approval. The statement shifted the balance subtly but unmistakably. Authority, once assumed transferable, was now documented as anchored. Emily began outlining an accelerated amendment option that would convert founder veto power into a symbolic advisory vote in exchange for enhanced dividend allocation. The numbers were attractive. The proposal was polished. Margaret listened without interruption. When Emily finished, Margaret addressed the board calmly. She did not criticize the alternative. She referred instead to operational continuity. She highlighted the importance of measured delegation tied to performance metrics rather than immediate title reclassification. She pointed to the benchmarks in her proposal: revenue stability over 4 consecutive quarters, debt ratio ceilings, compliance audits conducted by independent review. Each point was grounded in company history rather than personal preference. The room grew quieter as she spoke, not because her voice was louder, but because her reasoning was structured. Thomas Reed confirmed that her phased approach aligned with conservative fiscal management practices that had historically protected the company during downturns. Daniel reviewed both documents side by side, his expression shifting from defense to evaluation. After nearly an hour of discussion, a motion was introduced to adopt Margaret's structured transition framework as the temporary governing plan pending further review. The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. The motion carried. Emily did not object publicly. She closed her tablet with controlled precision and nodded once. It was not defeat. It was recalibration. Margaret did not display satisfaction. She simply acknowledged the vote and thanked the board for prioritizing compliance and stability. When the meeting adjourned, several board members lingered briefly near her seat, offering quiet remarks about institutional memory and steady leadership. She responded with polite gratitude, nothing more. As she returned to her office, an updated internal memo was already being drafted to reflect the board's decision. The language emphasized collaboration and long-term strategy. In the hallway, employees resumed their routines, unaware of the technical vote that had just reshaped executive authority. In her office, Margaret placed the approved proposal into her binder and secured it in the drawer beside the original charter. The documents now rested together, past and present aligned. At 4 o'clock, Daniel knocked lightly and stepped inside. He did not argue. He did not defend. He simply said, "I understand now." Margaret looked at him steadily. "This company was never about control," she replied. "It was about structure." Daniel nodded, absorbing the distinction. Outside, a delivery truck pulled away from the loading dock precisely on schedule. Inside the building, leadership had shifted without raised voices, without spectacle, without retaliation. It had shifted because documentation outweighed assumption. And in that quiet shift, the future of the company had changed direction, not through force, but through foundation. 3 months passed without spectacle, and the company adjusted to its revised framework with a steadiness that surprised even the board. Quarterly numbers were released at the end of the first cycle under the structured transition plan, and they reflected modest growth, controlled spending, and reduced executive overhead. The branding initiatives Emily had championed were not eliminated, but they were phased according to the financial benchmarks Margaret had outlined. Oversight did not slow progress. It refined it. Margaret maintained her presence in the office 4 days a week, arriving at 8:30 in the morning and leaving before 6 in the evening. She no longer signed every vendor contract, but she reviewed compliance reports and chaired the quarterly audit meetings. Her tone in those meetings remained consistent, direct, unemotional, focused on documentation. Emily adapted as well, though the adjustment required visible restraint. She led marketing expansions and digital restructuring projects, presenting data-driven proposals that aligned with the newly adopted thresholds. In meetings, she began referencing historical performance trends before introducing new initiatives, a subtle acknowledgement that growth was strongest when grounded in precedent. Daniel observed the shift carefully. For the first time since assuming the role of chief executive officer, he was not mediating between ambition and tradition. He was integrating them. One afternoon, during a review of second quarter projections, a supply chain manager pointed out that a proposed warehouse expansion exceeded the agreed-upon debt ratio ceiling by 2%. The room fell quiet. Emily glanced at the spreadsheet, recalculated silently, and nodded. "Then we revised the timeline," she said. It was a small moment, almost procedural, but Margaret noticed it. No resistance, no dismissal, just compliance with structure. After the meeting, Daniel remained behind in the conference room as Margaret gathered her papers. "You were right about one thing," he said carefully. "Stability builds confidence faster than speed." Margaret did not respond with satisfaction. She adjusted the stack of documents in her hands. "Speed is useful," she said, "but only when direction is clear." Daniel considered that quietly. Outside the glass walls, employees moved through the hallway with renewed assurance. Rumors of internal conflict had faded, replaced by discussions of steady performance and long-term planning. The board, once cautious, now cited the company as an example of disciplined governance in industry meetings. Margaret did not seek recognition for the outcome. She did not correct those who credited the board collectively. She understood that influence did not require applause. In early autumn, the company hosted its annual stakeholder reception in the lobby beneath the brushed steel logo. Investors, partners, and long-term clients gathered among tall floral arrangements and polished presentation displays. Emily delivered a confident overview of expansion plans calibrated within the approved framework. Daniel spoke about continuity and resilience. When Margaret was invited to offer closing remarks, she stepped to the podium without flourish. She did not recount personal sacrifices. She did not reference procedural disputes. She spoke instead about responsibility. "Every company inherits a foundation," she said evenly. Growth depends on honoring it. The statement was brief, but it resonated through the room. Applause followed, measured and respectful. Later that evening, as the last guests departed and the lobby lights dimmed, Margaret stood for a moment beneath the logo bearing her husband's name. The steel letters reflected the overhead lighting exactly as they had months earlier, yet the air felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, balanced. Emily approached her, heels echoing softly against the marble floor. "Your framework is working," she said, her tone no longer defensive but thoughtful. Margaret met her gaze steadily. "It is not mine," she replied. "It belongs to the company." Emily nodded, absorbing the distinction. There was no apology exchanged. No dramatic reconciliation, only acknowledgement. As Margaret walked toward the exit, coat draped over her arm, she understood that the most effective response had never been removal or retaliation. It had been reinforcement. The structure remained intact. The future, once presumed redirected, now moved forward on steadier ground. And the quiet decision she had made months earlier to insist on procedure had reshaped not only authority, but direction. 1 year later, the annual report was presented in the same conference room where the transition had first been announced, but the tone of the room had changed in ways that no single document could measure. Revenue had grown steadily across 4 consecutive quarters, debt remained below the established ceiling, and operational audits reflected improved compliance ratings. The structured transition framework was no longer described as temporary. It had become standard practice. Margaret Whitmore no longer attended every executive session. She selected meetings strategically, focusing on governance reviews and long-term capital planning. Her presence was neither ceremonial nor dominant. It was stabilizing. Emily had matured into her role with visible discipline. Her proposals arrived fully benchmarked against the agreed-upon metrics, each initiative accompanied by risk assessments and contingency plans. She no longer framed modernization as replacement. She framed it as extension. Daniel, positioned between legacy and innovation, no longer appeared divided. He had grown comfortable referencing the original 1987 charter during strategy discussions, not as a constraint, but as a foundation. The board, once cautious and uncertain, now cited the company's governance structure as a competitive advantage. Investors noted the balance between generational leadership and procedural continuity. Employees sensed it as well. Turnover decreased. Internal promotions increased. Stability, once dismissed as resistance, proved to be momentum of a different kind. One quiet afternoon in early spring, Margaret stood again in the lobby beneath the brushed steel logo. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting clean reflections across the marble floor. A newly hired operations manager was being given a tour nearby, listening attentively as Emily explained the company's origin story. Margaret heard her daughter-in-law describe the early years accurately, including the 400-square-foot garage, the borrowed phone line, and the founder clause that protected structural decisions. There was no bitterness in the retelling. There was respect. Margaret did not interrupt. She did not correct. She simply observed. Later that week, during a quarterly governance review, Margaret announced that she would begin reducing her in-office days from 4 per week to 2, effective at the start of the next fiscal year. The room did not tense. It did not panic. The systems were in place. Daniel nodded with quiet understanding. Emily responded with a measured, professional acknowledgement. No one interpreted the decision as surrender. It was sequencing. After the meeting concluded, Daniel walked with Margaret toward the elevator. "I thought leadership meant moving faster than everyone else," he said thoughtfully. Margaret pressed the button and waited. "Leadership means knowing when to slow down," she replied. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. As she stepped inside, she looked back once at the conference room down the hall. It no longer felt like contested ground. It felt aligned. Months earlier, her response to exclusion had not been confrontation. It had been precision. She had not removed anyone. She had reinforced structure. In doing so, she had altered the trajectory of the company without raising her voice or dismantling relationships. The simple insistence on procedure had changed the direction of authority, restored balance, and secured the future of a business built decades earlier on discipline and foresight. As the elevator descended to the parking garage, Margaret felt neither triumph nor regret. She felt continuity. Above ground, Trucks bearing the company logo departed on schedule, engines steady, routes mapped, deliveries certain. Inside the building, leadership now moved with similar rhythm. The future had not been seized. It had been recalibrated, and the quiet decision to stand on documented foundation had ensured that legacy and progress would move forward together.